In the context of the genocide in Gaza, senior Israeli generals have repeatedly said that if the United States were to cut off the arms supplies to Israel, they could not prosecute their war in Gaza anymore. The leverage that the U.S. has as Israel's biggest ally and backer is tremendous. The problem is that American presidents are very reluctant to use that leverage for reasons that I talked about in my previous answer. I don't see the Trump administration using the leverage that they have to end the war in Gaza or to push for a just settlement. That's because all of Trump's closest foreign policy advisors, from his son-in-law to the new Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, to the National Security Advisor for Donald Trump, Mike Waltz, to the new American ambassador at the United Nations, Elise Stefanik, and the new hawkish and very extreme American ambassador to Israel, Mike Huckabee. These are all pro-Israel extremists. I don't believe there will be any shift with the incoming Trump administration and U.S. policy toward Israel Palestine. One of the things that is notable in thinking about American foreign policy generally, but especially American foreign policy toward the Israel Palestine conflict, is how both of the two main parties and much of the U.S. foreign policy establishment really have a very shared vision without any major substantive differences between them. And this is a position that's rooted in an Israel first policy. Israel has the right to safety, security, massive amounts of American aid, first and foremost. And the Palestinians maybe, possibly, might get a state if they demonstrate good behavior and if the Israeli government is willing to concede to them their basic national rights. This is a summary of what the two political parties basically stand for. The Democratic Party sometimes rhetorically talks about a two-state settlement, but they're not willing to pressure Israel, establish consequences for Israel if Israel is unwilling to support a two-state settlement to this conflict. In his final days as Secretary of State, Antony Blinken was going on a victory tour, sort of, praising himself and his administration for all of the wonderful things that they allegedly did. And in one of his interviews, he stated explicitly that any prospect for a Palestinian state would be dependent on and conditional upon Israel approving the creation of a Palestinian state. In other words, the Palestinians are destined to live as subhuman beings without national rights until their occupier and their oppressor decides to give them those rights. And the United States, is perfectly happy with that arrangement. Will continue to back and support and finance Israel without any consequences. So that's the current, American policy under the Democratic Party of the United States. The incoming Trump administration, as we saw last time when they were in power, had the most pro-Israel policy orientation in the history of the United States since the creation of the State of Israel in 1948. Trump moved the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem, violating international law and most of international public opinion, especially in the Arab and Islamic world. The Trump administration, formally recognized the Israeli annexation of the Syrian Golan Heights. The Trump administration had no problem with the expansion of Israeli settlements. The Trump administration cut off funding for the main humanitarian UN organization, UNRWA, to the Palestinians. The Trump administration shut down the Palestine Information Office in Washington, D.C. That's the Republican Party. In fact, the Republican Party, the mainstream of the Republican Party on the question of Israel-Palestine is in many ways closely aligned with the policies and the worldview of Benjamin Netanyahu. In fact, many of them are even to the right of Netanyahu. That's the Republican Party. So you basically have an American political system where both of the two mainstream political parties are firmly against the idea that the Palestinians are entitled to the same rights as the Israelis. That's the official position of both parties. Public opinion is a different matter. public opinion, unfortunately has very little influence over American foreign policy, which is one reason why the democracy here in the United States is so broken. But when you go and you survey people, you see much more balanced views in the public. But politically speaking, both of the two main political parties, as I just stated, are solidly pro-Israel, and it doesn't look like that's going to change anytime soon. Well, look, the United States has a huge amount of leverage over Israel, and we saw this recently in the context of this ceasefire negotiation. This was a ceasefire plan that was put on the table by Biden. It was available for implementation for the last 6 months. But Biden refused to sort of establish any consequences for Israel if they refused to sign on to the deal. As we got close to the inauguration of the new American president, it was clear that Trump wanted to come into office without any distraction, without any bad news that would undermine the party that's taking place, the celebration that's taking place in Washington, D.C. today. And he wanted some movement in terms of a ceasefire for hostages deal. And so he sent his special representative to Israel. All the reporting is that Netanyahu was pressured by the incoming Trump administration to sign on to the deal. And so that's the difference between the two administrations. Trump was able to flex some muscle to tell Netanyahu that he wanted him to sign this deal. So the influence, as we just saw recently, is tremendous, largely because of the massive amounts of American political and military support that the United States gives Israel. In the context of the genocide in Gaza, senior Israeli generals have repeatedly said that if the United States were to cut off the arms supplies to Israel, they could not prosecute their war in Gaza anymore. So the leverage that the U.S. has as Israel's biggest ally and backer is tremendous. The problem is that American presidents are very reluctant to use that leverage for reasons that I talked about in my previous answer. I don't see the Trump administration using the leverage that they have to end the war in Gaza or to push for a just settlement. That's because all of Trump's closest foreign policy advisors, from his son-in-law to the new Secretary of State Marco Rubio, to the National Security Advisor for Donald Trump, Mike Waltz, to the new American ambassador at the United Nations, Elise Stefanik, and the new hawkish and very extreme American ambassador to Israel, Mike Huckabee. These are all pro-Israel extremists. In fact, Mike Huckabee, the new U.S. ambassador to Israel, is so extreme that he's on record as saying that the Palestinian people do not exist as a nation. They're not a people that we have to worry about giving them any rights. So I don't see, given the strong, not just strong, but given the fanatical extremism in the Republican Party, which is Donald Trump's party, for the state of Israel, I don't see the United States doing anything to resolve the crisis in Gaza permanently or to promote a just resolution of the Israel-Palestine conflict. In fact, everything that is likely to happen will probably replicate what we saw in Trump's first term: more pro-Israel policies, possibly even supporting the Israeli annexation of parts of the West Bank, more pressure on the Palestinians. Yeah, I think this is going to be one of the big foreign policy challenges of the Trump administration, what to do about Iran. All of the close foreign policy advisors in the Trump administration, in other words, the voices that Trump is going to be hearing inside his National Security Council, in the White House, and from the State Department, is that Iran is the biggest threat to stability in the Middle East. The United States has to go after Iran hard, even to militarily attack Iran, to take out its nuclear program, and if possible, to promote regime change. Right now in Washington, D.C., there's a lot of excitement and support for what Israel has been doing in the region. And I'm speaking specifically about the Israeli policy of genocide in Gaza. Of course, it's not called genocide in Washington, D.C. It's called Israel defending itself. But Israeli policy since October the 7th is widely supported among the U.S. foreign policy establishment in the following way. that Israel has proven its worth as a loyal ally to the United States because it's doing things that the United States wants to do in the region but can't. But Israel is doing it for us. That's why we have to continue to support Israel. What is Israel doing? It's crushing Hamas. It's deeply eroding and almost destroying Hezbollah. It successfully assassinated Hassan Nasrallah. Israel contributed indirectly to the toppling of Bashar al-Assad. And so from the perspective of Washington, D.C., and from the perspective of Israel, this is all a wonderful development. The only thing that's left to do in the Middle East now is to go after Iran. Iran is much weaker than it was before. Iran is, the regime maybe will topple if we pressure it a bit. So I think the Trump administration, or at least Donald Trump himself, is going to be hearing that narrative, that let's go after Iran, let's pressure it. If they don't give concessions on their nuclear program, let's attack it. Maybe we can even get lucky and topple the regime, and a friendly pro-American regime will come into power, and the Middle East will be a wonderful situation. I think that's an option that's on the table. What I'm hearing right now is that Trump himself is not personally inclined to a military engagement with Iran. Trump is fundamentally a man who's driven by his own ego, his own prestige, and his own aspirations to be, a respected world leader at some level. And so I think he is going to want to try and strike, if possible, some deal with Iran to deal with its nuclear program and perhaps deal with the broader problems that the United States has with Iran's policy in the Middle East. I'm skeptical that that's going to produce any results, because to deal with, to have a diplomatic engagement in policy that can reach an agreement with Iran requires an intense amount of diplomatic engagement, the expenditure of political capital for the president to invest in that posture, and critically, to try and change the views of his own party on Iran, which are extremely hawkish and pro-war. So for Trump to be able to do all of that and have a diplomatic deal with Iran, to me sounds like an impossibility. I predict what's going to happen is Trump is going to, in many ways, repeat what we saw during his first term. More maximum pressure, more sanctions, more attempt to perhaps prevent Iran from selling its oil on the international market, squeezing Iran, hoping that the more that the Iranian economy is squeezed, then they'll come to Donald Trump and say, well, let's make a deal. Trump personally, again, I want to emphasize, is not in favor of a military conflict with Iran, but because he's so unpredictable, perhaps he can be convinced. This is not someone, this new American president is not someone who has a vision or a strategy for the Middle East or with respect to Iran. He's very much impulsive, and he can be convinced of almost anything. So that's why I'm very worried. You're right to point out the challenge of China, but the challenge of China for the United States is basically a question of economic trade. And, Russia and China's involvement in the Middle East, I think, is in many ways exaggerated in some circles. We saw recently that, Russia had invested very heavily in supporting the Assad regime. But when the Assad regime's moment of truth came at the end of November and early December, when the rebels from Idlib province attacked and were, approaching all of the major cities in Syria, the Russian government under Putin basically abandoned the Assad regime and gave up and is now pulling out their forces from Syria. So Russia's, engagement in the Middle East, I think, is basically over. Russia is completely focused and obsessed on the war in Ukraine. China's interest in the Middle East, again, is not political and it's not military, it's economic. China likes to play all sides. China, supports Iran, but has very good and close trading relationships with Israel, Saudi Arabia, and every other country in the region. So that's the primary interest of the Chinese government. They don't have an interest in, in solving the problems of the region. They simply want to invest. They're playing a long game. They have economic interests in the region. And so I don't see the Trump administration really fighting with Russia or China over Middle East policy. The clash between these global powers, primarily the United States in China will be over trade, will be over issues in the South China Sea. Those are flashpoints that I think are worth watching.